Welcome to From Beyond. Tonight I'm sharing some terrifying true Ouija stories. And stick around till the end for the most terrifying tale of all. Carla's Ouija board was homemade because she kept it a secret from her parents. Her mum had sworn them off Ouija. She had had a bad experience with the talking board as a kid, but never went into detail with Carla about what had happened. Because her parents couldn't know about it, Carla decided to play alone. She knew about the first rule of Ouija, but figured it was no big deal. One night she tried to call on the spirits. She set her homemade board up in her bedroom and asked if anyone would like to respond. But nobody did. She persisted because she felt sure there was a spirit in her room, and as soon as she put her hands back on the planchette, the air thickened and the room grew colder. Despite the chills running down Carla's spine, the planchette never moved. After a while of asking more questions and getting no reply, Carla gave up and lay in bed to go to sleep. Just as she was dozing off, she heard a loud on the roof above. Seconds later, her dad opened the bedroom door. "Did you hear something?" he asked. "I think so," she replied. "Maybe the cat?" The sound returned, and it definitely wasn't the cat. It sounded like heavy footsteps, like an angry man stomping across their roof. Scared, Carla ran downstairs, and her dad followed behind her. "Mum," she said, entering the living room, "there's someone on the roof." As her mum tried to calm her down, Carla's dad ran into the back room. He came back out with his shotgun. He went outside as Carla and her mum listened to him climb onto the roof, feeling tense with fear. A few dreadful minutes later, that seemed to pass slower and slower as they listened, silently waiting. Suddenly the door opened and Carla's dad came back inside. "Well, whoever it was, they got away," he said, shaking his head. "As I got up there, I saw a shadow jump down from the roof, but it disappeared into the woods." Carla was freaked out, but couldn't bring herself to let them know that she'd used the Ouija board in the house. So instead, she marched upstairs, locked her bedroom door, and locked her window, feeling shaken. She looked out into the darkness beyond the garden, into the trees that surrounded their home, wondering if the shadow her dad had seen was still watching the house. She got the Ouija board out from under her bed, folded it in half with the planchette inside, and put a paperclip on it so it couldn't be opened. She knew it was a pretty flimsy solution, but at the time it was all she could think of. She slid the board back under her bed, climbed under the covers, and turned out the light. She was lying there, unable to sleep, worrying about the man on the roof and wondering where he had come from. A growl came across her room. She sat straight up. Again, she thought the cat might have been responsible for the sound, so slowly she pulled back the duvet and looked around the room. But the cat was nowhere to be found. Weary, scared by now, she crawled back in her bed, turned off the lights, and tried to close her eyes. The moment she shut her eyes, the growl sounded again. Louder. Closer. Afraid, Carla turned on the lights and left them on this time. And after a long time sitting in silence, she finally drifted off to sleep. Ever since that day with the board, Carla's house has been plagued by strange and threatening sounds. They've been heard by everyone, even her parents. She never told her parents about what had happened with the board, and has kept it a secret to this day. But as things escalated, Carla began to believe a demon was living in their home. And even worse, she knew exactly how it had got there. Halloween night, 1968. And after trick-or-treating, Crystal thought it would be fun to bring a Ouija board over to Nancy's house for them to try. Nancy wasn't sure. The board gave her the creeps. And her mum was a psychic who knew a lot about the occult. and she thought the Ouija board was dangerous. So when she saw Crystal had brought one over, she told the girls to be careful and that it wasn't a toy. Nancy had never played before, so Crystal taught her how it worked. She started by asking silly questions to the board and getting silly responses. "What was I in another life?" asked Crystal. "You were a needle in God's eye," the board replied. Crystal swore she wasn't moving the planchette, but it spelled out its responses so easily that Nancy was convinced that she must be. Every time she asked a question, the planchette would fly across the board, quickly responding, as if it were waiting for any opportunity to communicate. When it was Nancy's turn to talk to the spirit, she decided to ask the same thing. "What was I in another life?" "You were a nail in God's hand," the board said. Nancy was growing tired of this, and decided to ask the board a really pressing question for girls their age. "What boys do I like?" she said. "Go to hell," the board replied. Crystal laughed and said, "Okay, so who will I marry?" The board spelled, "You will marry the devil." Unperturbed, Nancy asked, "Is there a spirit in our house now?" The planchette flew rapidly across the board, even quicker than before. It spelled out, "We're here." Taken aback, the girls looked at each other before asking again. "What are the names of the spirits in the house?" The board spelled out the names, but the girls couldn't understand what it was saying. "Where did you come from?" Nancy asked. "Hell," the board spelled. "Where you're going." The girls screamed, and Nancy's mother rushed into the room. When she saw how upset they were, she told them to stop using the board. But quickly, Crystal asked another question, feeling brave now that the mother was there. The planchette started spinning as she did, and Nancy's mum grabbed a pen and paper and started writing down each letter as it spelled. "We're here, and we won't leave." It then started spelling out a string of curse words, followed by a message that made the girls' hands fly around with the planchette. "Take your hands off it now," screamed Nancy's mum. They were frightened, as the room filled with a cold chill. Nancy's mother had a terrified look on her face, as she reflected on what the board had just said. They won't be leaving. Out of nowhere, a large sound started banging on the stairs leading to their basement, and Nancy's little sister came flying into the room now in tears. She ran up to their mother, gasping for breath. "Something touched me," she said. "Something slapped my back. No one's down there, Mum, and something slapped my back." Their mother gasped when she lifted up Bonnie's shirt and found red marks on her. "And I heard a voice say something," said Bonnie, tears streaming down her cheeks. "What did it say, Bonnie?" said their mum, trying to keep calm. "It said, 'You hate your mother.'" "It's okay," said her mum. "Nothing's going to happen, but this is enough. Crystal, put that thing on the coffee table and don't forget to take it home with you later. You three just take a few minutes and cool down and just play. It's going to be alright, just go play." Crystal put the Ouija board on the table, and all three girls started to walk out of the room. Just as Nancy was at the door, she saw something out of the corner of her eye. It flew across the sitting room, into the kitchen, and flew past her mum, then crashed into the wall. "What the hell was that?" screamed her mum. She looked under the table next to where the Ouija board was and found something startling. It was a camera, now broken. They were bewildered about why the specific item would be thrown across the room, and it was an old 35mm film camera, so they decided to have it developed, just in case the spirit had imprinted itself onto the film somehow. But that was the next day. They still had to contend with the rest of that evening. Most of the girls spent the night being pretty quiet afterwards. There was an air of fear that hung in the room, and they couldn't shake the cold chill that permeated their bones. Crystal took her Ouija board when she went home, and Nancy's mum dropped the film from the camera into the pharmacy the next day. 1 week later, when it was ready to be picked up, they sat in the car and looked at the photos. Every single photo that they developed from the film were covered in smoke. Through the white mist that were present on the photos, they could make out a dark, hazy figure that looked like it was standing in the corner of the room. Since then, Nancy said she'd never touch a Ouija board again. Two friends were shopping for books downtown in Orlando one day, when at the back of the store they found a Ouija board. For a laugh, they decided to buy it and give it a try, and the two girls, Marta and Jenny, took the board home to Marta's house and tried to contact a spirit. When it seemed to be successful and somebody answered, they asked the spirit many questions about its past. It answered politely, and they thought they were getting to know this person. But then they decided to change the topic, and they asked the spirit how many people were in the room. It immediately replied that there were 4. There were only the 2 girls and the spirit in the room, as far as they knew. So who was the unknown 4th? Both girls figured it was just the other one trying to mess around, so they took their hands off the planchette to end the game. But just as they did, the planchette moved on its own and spelled out, "Close." They thought that should mean they should close the board, so they did. But first, they said 5 prayers, asking God for his blessing of the house, then moved the planchette to goodbye. A few days later, Marta decided to tell her mum what had happened with the board. Her mum was really upset, and asked Marta to never use it again. She said their family had a bad history with spirit boards, and she sat her down and she told her a story. She said Marta's grandmother had used a board when she was in her 20s. She really enjoyed it and would constantly consult the spirits for advice, asking questions and trying to get information about the world beyond. She loved it so much she became lost in the spirit board. Her grandmother started to see things she couldn't explain. Objects would move throughout the house, and she felt some kind of presence, but she felt it coming from inside her when she used the board. The family decided to call in a priest to exorcise her of any of the spirits she might be carrying due to her experimentation with the board. For a while it seemed to work, and Marta's grandmother never played with the Ouija board again. But she did tell her daughter, Marta's mother, about what had happened to her, warning her off the board. Of course, as Marta's mother was in her late 20s, her and her friend decided they should play with the board together. And they had a lot of fun, sometimes making jokes and moving the planchette around themselves. One night they contacted a spirit who seemed very interested in Marta's grandmother. It asked Marta's mother, where was she? Why didn't she play anymore? It said the spirits missed her. Marta's mother became a little spooked, remembering the story her mother had told her. So she and her friend closed the board and said some prayers. Marta's friend was jealous that Marta's mother had managed to contact such an active spirit, so she continued playing with the board alone after Marta's mother had left. After this, she encountered strange things around her home. Objects started moving around the house, and the spirit she was communicating with always seemed angry and agitated. Eventually she told Marta's mother what she had been doing and called her in to help. So they got a priest to take the board and dispose of it safely, and the 2 women never played again. Marta, like her mother before her, didn't believe the stories. She and her friend Jenny continued to play, and were always contacted by the same spirit, the good one, that had told them to close the board before. Every time they contacted this spirit, they would ask him how many people were in the room, and now he would always say 3. They asked him to warn them if another spirit ever entered again, and he said that he would. Things moved along fine for the girls with their experimentation with the board, until one evening, when they were communicating with a new spirit friend, the planchette started to spin. It spelled close again, and then quickly, evil, bad, 4 in a room. But this time, the girls didn't close the board right away. Marta's mother was out, and they knew they could go for longer this time. So rather than closing it, they decided to try and contact the 4th person in the room. "Who are you?" they asked. "I am," was the reply. "Are you good or evil?" No response. They decided to try and contact the good spirit again, but the 4th person wouldn't let him talk. For every question they asked, he just kept saying, "No." Just as the girl started to get upset about the strength of the spirit, he started asking questions about Marta. He said he felt like he knew her from somewhere. Marta jumped away from the board, shocked. She knew who the spirit was, and that it had plagued her mother and her grandmother before her. Just then her mother returned, and Marta ran crying into her mother's arms, apologising for never believing her when she told her about the board. Her mother knew exactly what had happened. She took the Ouija board from the girls and put it in the living room. Jenny had no idea what was going on. Marta's mum left to get the Bible, and that's when the planchette started moving again. It spelled, "I know who you are now." Marta's mum returned. "Stop. I order you to stop," she shouted. She sat down at the board, and the girls sat terrified behind her watching. She was worried that the spirit might try and attach itself to either one of the girls, so she started reciting prayers, trying to cast the spirit away. She said, "Do what you want to me, but not my child. You're not going to touch her," and she called on God to cleanse the house. That's when things escalated. At the mention of God's name, objects started flying around the house, and they could hear a strange sound, like someone was breathing hard in the room. Then, Marta felt someone slap her face. Her mum became furious, placed the Bible directly onto the board and continued to pray out loud. Marta joined her, and now so did Jenny. After a minute, as their prayers got louder and louder, the room quietened. The energy in the room felt positive again, and the planchette started to move on its own. It spelled, "Close." The girls knew who it was, the good spirit they had first contacted. Marta's mother gently closed the board, took it away, and the girls never saw the board again. If you're enjoying this video, then please like and subscribe so I know to make more like this. You can also follow the podcast on Patreon, Spreaker, and Instagram. Now back to the story. It was 1994, and Karen was going to college in Philadelphia. One weekend, a massive winter storm overtook her town, and everyone was holed up indoors. Karen and her roommate Jan decided to have a couple of friends over to keep them from going insane from boredom. Once they were all together, Jan suggested that Karen get out her Ouija board. The other two thought it was a great little idea, and it'd be fun to try and spook each other a bit. So Jan and their friend Mike had the Ouija board set up between them in the middle of the room. But almost immediately, everyone there could sense a spiritual presence. It filled the room and hung heavy in the air. The planchette moved on its own before Jan could even ask a question. "I want Karen," it spelled. Karen sat in the background, surprised. She felt a shiver run down her spine. Why me, she wondered to herself. She didn't like that it had spelled her name, but since she wasn't actually the one playing, she thought it'd be safe to ask it some questions. "Who is this?" she asked. "Stephen," the planchette spelled. Everyone in the room laughed. Everyone except Karen. The others knew that Karen had a younger brother named Stephen, and thought it was probably a coincidence the spirit had guessed the same name. But what they didn't know, that Stephen was a family name, and her uncle was also named Stephen. So was her grandfather. "How do you know me?" asked Karen. The room fell silent as the planchette moved under Jen and Mike's fingers. "Grandpa," it spelled. Jen looked up at Karen, confused. "You have a grandpa named Stephen too?" Karen nodded. "He passed away when I was 8. Everyone's attention drew back to the board. Karen had to know if this really was her grandpa, so she racked her brain for some early memories that only he would know about. Finally, she said, "What was the special treat you used to bring me when you visited?" The planchette moved to spell bubblegum. Karen knew her friends couldn't have known that. Even her mother had probably forgotten. She leant back on the couch, now looking a bit pale. "What does that mean?" asked Jen. Karen said, "When my grandpa used to come to visit me, he would bring me his little cigar box filled with bubblegum cigars, and we'd sit together outside. He would smoke, and I would sit next to him, pretend to smoke in with the bubblegum. They stared at Karen, in shock, but then quickly looked back to the board when the planchette moved on its own. "I love you," it spelled. Karen hesitated. "I love you too, Grandpa." Then the planchette moved to goodbye, and they closed the board. Later that night, Karen was in bed, thinking about her grandpa and all that happened. She remembered a dream she'd had when she was a kid. Her grandpa had been gone for 4 years at that point. She was about 12. But he came to her in a dream, and she had asked him, "Can I go with you to heaven, Grandpa?" "No," he said, "but I'm okay." So perhaps, now another 4 years after that experience, he was just checking in again, to let her know he was alright. This story comes from Tulsa, Oklahoma. Dave and his wife Michelle decided to take an old Ouija board to their friend's house for some beers and fun. Their friends, Mike and Patricia, were kind of the perfect couple to do this with, as Mike had always believed, but Patricia was a pretty firm skeptic. They decided to show Patricia a thing or two about the power of the board, but they got more than they bargained for, and by the end of the night, Dave and Mike found themselves in a mental health ward. The group made themselves comfortable around a coffee table in Mike's living room. They dimmed the lights and lit some candles. Almost as soon as their hands touched the planchette, it started moving with a force around the board, swooshing over "hello" over and over again. They never got the chance to learn too much about the spirit they were communicating with, however, because almost immediately it started calling Patricia names. As it moved around the board, cursing at her and telling them that it didn't like her, Patricia just rolled her eyes, knowing that the group was trying to get a rise out of her. Then, the spirit claimed that Patricia was cheating on Mike with one of her ex-boyfriends. Everyone's mood kind of dropped. "Ask the spirit what her ex-boyfriend's name is," said Mike abruptly. Dave and Michelle only knew Patricia through Mike, so they had no idea who this ex could be. Still, they asked the spirit, and his response was Matt. Mike's face immediately turned red, but that wasn't all the spirit had to say. He went on to reveal that Patricia had been having sex with Matt earlier that day, while Mike was at work. "In which room?" Mike said calmly. The planchette spelled, "your bed." Patricia looked uncomfortable, but still denied the spirit's message. Mike jumped up and went to search the bedroom. A minute later he stormed back into the room, holding a man's watch that wasn't his. The planchette moved again. "I want to scare her," it said. Mike and Patricia just started arguing, abandoning the board and forgetting all about it. But eventually she talked him down again, and the group tried to relax with a few beers. At midnight, Dave and Michelle decided it was time for a little more Ouija board, so they contacted the same spirit, but he was still only in the mood to swear at and insult Patricia. After this, everyone thought that was enough and decided to end the night, but just as they decided that, the planchette moved again. "Window," it spelled. Everyone looked up towards the living room window, but saw nothing. The planchette moved again, spelling the word over and over again, with increasing speed. "Window, window, window, window." Patricia headed into the kitchen. "Someone's looking through the window," she yelled. Dave and Michael ran out the front door to see who was out there, and sure enough, a tall figure was running away down their street. They hurried after him, but he darted down an alleyway and disappeared into a building. Suddenly Dave and Michael stopped dead, as they were surrounded by policemen in their cruisers. They realized they were standing outside a mental health facility, and they quickly explained to the cops about the man who'd been peering through the window of Mike's house. A hospital worker who'd come outside explained the man had escaped from the facility about an hour before, and the cops had been looking for him. Mike and Dave waited outside, talking the cops down and getting themselves out of trouble, when the police decided to go inside and talk to the man that had escaped. After a short while, the police officer returned to tell the man what was going on. He said the guy is definitely disturbed, He didn't want to answer any of our questions. But he did tell the hospital faculty the devil had spoken to him earlier tonight. He told the man to look for him, and when he gave him directions on where to find him, it led him straight to your house. Mike and Dave felt chills. They walked home to tell Michelle and Patricia what had happened. Both women were scared and Patricia wasn't happy. She threw the Ouija board out of the house, and she told Dave and Michelle not to come back. But before they left, the guys decided to burn the board in the backyard. After dousing the board in kerosene for good measure, Mike threw a match on it. But the board didn't burst into flame. Instead, it ignited a long flame that trailed and flew across the yard and then exploded in a giant ball of fire. Mike was the closest to the blast and started screaming, burns covering his body. They quickly called an ambulance and he and Patricia went to the hospital. He had 2nd and 3rd degree burns and was temporarily blinded by the kerosene. After the ambulance left, Dave picked up the board, which was still laying in the yard, and the grass around it had been singed, but the board itself was completely unharmed. Dave threw it in the trash can behind the house. The next day, Dave received a call from Patricia. She was livid, accusing him of putting the board back in the kitchen, where the peeping Tom had seen her. Dave tried to tell her that he'd thrown it away, but she didn't believe him. For about a year after that, Mike had to have outpatient treatment for his burns. Dave and Mike stayed friends, and one night Mike had told Dave that Patricia had eventually admitted that she was cheating on him, and the board had all the facts straight that night, down to who it was and where they were doing it. Patricia may have been a skeptic before, but she couldn't be anymore. But she learned the hard way. Never play Ouija if you have a secret you want to keep. Dylan and Jake went to their friend Mark's family cabin one autumn weekend. The 3 teenagers were looking forward to having a place to themselves, but didn't have too many great ideas about what they should do while they were there. Finally, someone suggested they try out a Ouija board, and everyone enthusiastically agreed. The 3 boys tried and were able to contact the spirit. But the first one they spoke to, it wasn't very friendly. All it wanted to communicate was that Jake was evil, and it kept spelling out die over and over again. The boys weren't amused at this. It wasn't the fun game they'd imagined, so they moved the planchette to goodbye. But as they did, the spirit jerked it away and spelled no, die. The boys kept trying to say goodbye to the spirit, but every time they did, the spirit jerked the planchette away again and told them to die. Almost half an hour had passed. Then Dylan had an idea. "Show yourself," he said to the board. Immediately, the planchette slid to goodbye. The front door of the cabin began to shake, then stopped. The boys sat silently for a while, but then figured it was just their imagination and was probably nothing to worry about. The spirit was gone after all. So they went to dinner, not thinking too much of it. After a few hours of winding each other up and wondering what had happened with the board, they decided to play again later that night. But when they sat at the board, they knew immediately they'd found the same spirit. No, die, were the only words it spelled. They decided to try asking it questions to get its mind off those 2 words. So Mark asked, "Will I have children?" The planchette slid to yes. "What about me?" said Jake. The planchette moved again, spelling now. No one really understood what that meant, so they just kept asking questions. But Mark and Dylan could tell Jake was a bit upset, so they decided to stop shortly after and move the planchette to goodbye. Once again, as they tried to end the session, no, die, the planchette spelled out. Then it started flying around the board, out of control, and it flew all the way off the board and onto the floor, where it lay still. Dylan was the most superstitious of the group, and insisted they couldn't let the session end without saying goodbye properly. If they didn't close it, it might release the spirit to walk the earth. So they had no choice to continue talking to it, but everything they asked received only one response: die. "Who are you?" Mark finally asked. The planchette moved. It spelled Lucifer. That was too much for Jake. He got scared and ran from the cabin, and the boys gave up on the board eventually without closing it and just went home the next day. On Monday, Dylan went to school and saw Jake wasn't there. He started asking around if anyone had seen him, but then he heard a rumour that Jake was in the hospital. The first thing Dylan thought was something horrible must have happened to him after they contacted Lucifer over the weekend. Panicking, he started calling Jake's phone, and after several tries, someone finally answered. It was Jake's dad. "Hey, it's Dylan. I heard at school that Jake's in the hospital. What happened? Is he okay?" There was a short pause at the other end before Jake's dad said, "Jake's fine. It's actually his girlfriend Tiffany who's in the hospital. She had a miscarriage over the weekend." Dylan was shocked. A miscarriage? I didn't even know she was pregnant. Jake's dad said she didn't tell anyone, so we didn't know either. She was about 20 weeks along, and it was a baby girl. Suddenly, Dylan realised exactly what Lucifer was telling him through the board the other night. Jake really would have a child now, but in the worst possible way. Sam got his first Ouija board when he was 13. He was fascinated with the idea of communicating with spirits and seeing what was on the other side. Maybe there was something special about Sam, because he seemed to be able to use the Ouija board all alone, without anything going wrong, at least for a while. His very first time he tried it, he contacted a ghost named Daniel. He was very friendly and easy to talk to. Sam would chat with him for hours at a time. Daniel said he had died a long time ago, and he told Sam he had a brother named Charles. But he said Charles wasn't like him. He said he was mean, and he liked to get in trouble. He also said that Charles was close by. Sam didn't really know what that meant. Every day after school he would talk to Daniel through the board. Contacting him was so easy. He would just put his fingers on the planchette and instantly Daniel was there. But increasingly he found after each session he would feel completely exhausted. He didn't realise it at the time, but his energy was being drained straight into the Ouija board. One day, Sam came home and got out his board, as he usually did. "Is Daniel there?" he asked. "No," was the reply. Sam was taken aback by this. Daniel was always there. Then suddenly, he had a creeping sense of dread. "Is this Charles?" he said. Planchette moved to yes. Sam decided to proceed with caution. He asked Charles a few questions, but then the more he communicated with him, he realised Charles wasn't as bad as Daniel made him out to be. Maybe he had a good side, Sam thought. And before long, Sam and Charles had also developed a friendship, and he was spending more time talking to Charles than he was to Daniel through the board. Ever curious about ways to communicate with spirits, Sam had heard about automatic writing and decided one day he would give it a go. He thought as he found it so easy to communicate with them through the board, they would probably write through him too. He took a paper and pen, poised his hand, and attempted to call on the spirits. After only a few short seconds, his hand started to move on its own accord, and he found that the spirits could write through him. With this new ability, Sam felt closer to the spirits than ever. He spent more and more time communicating through automatic writing. It was so much easier than the board, but as his connection with the spirits grew stronger, the messages became more sinister. Both Daniel and Charles spent a lot more time talking about death. Sam's death. After a while of this, Sam was starting to feel scared, and he started to notice the energy that was being drained from him every time he contacted Daniel and Charles. One time, when he was angry because Charles kept talking about death, Sam decided to forcefully think of a random word while the spirit was writing. Surprisingly, that was a word that Charles wrote out through his hand. Sam thought it was funny that he could exert some kind of control over a spirit like that. But he also realised it meant the spirits had access to his inner thoughts while they were connected. After this, he kept trying to throw them off with the interjections in his mind. But every time he strongly thought of a word and made them write it, it just made them more angry. More and more, Daniel and Charles started telling Sam that he should kill himself. Sam couldn't take this anymore. He decided to take his Ouija board outside, and he broke it into pieces and threw it away. He vowed to never try automatic writing again, and after a while, the spirits fell silent. At the young age of 13, Sam had learned a valuable lesson about contacting the beyond. Someone may befriend you and gain your trust, but if they start to steal your strength or influence your mind, they're probably evil deep down, perhaps even inhuman. Not all spirits are spirits, Sam learned. Some are far more sinister. One night in college, John invited his 4 friends, Liam, Chris, Jack and Paul, over to his apartment. The usual agenda was to drink and get into trouble, but this time they decided to change things up a bit. They decided to try and have a seance. At about 10:30 p.m, John brought out a Ouija board, and they improvised with a large whiskey glass for a planchette. The group had decided that John would be the medium, since he was the host of the party, and keeping true to what they thought a seance should look like, they turned off all the lights and lit candles around the living room. And everyone gathered around the board, quiet for the first time that night. John said to the whiskey glass, if there is any spirit or presence in this apartment, then move the glass. All were surprised to see the glass move immediately. They glanced around at each other before returning to the board. Would you be able to spell your name for us, please? Asked John. The glass moved. Certainly, it spelled. Okay, what is your name? John said. Ilkill, it spelled. Ilkill, said Liam. What kind of name is that? Isn't it obvious, said Paul. It's an anagram for killer. The guys looked at each other nervously. Should we continue? Asked Jack. Maybe, said Chris. They decided as long as they followed the right procedure and ended the session with a prayer, they'd probably be okay. And they read on the internet that if the spirit mentions a portal, they should close the session immediately, as that was how demons entered the human world. They all agreed to proceed with caution and not provoke the spirit. They returned to the board, and John said, if Ilkill is still here, could you please make a sign? Ah, yelled Chris. What is it? Said Jack. I just felt someone hit me. Chris had his hand on his right cheek. Fear spread throughout the room. Why'd you hit Chris? Asked John. I do not like him, said the board. Why? John said. No reply. Are you a ghost? Asked John. The glass moved to no. Then what are you? The glass moved again. Suddenly, the room fell ice cold. El Penumbra, spelled. The guys didn't need to ask each other what El Penumbra meant in English. They all knew. It meant demon. Ilkill, are you a demon? Asked John. The glass moved to yes. Then, now die. The temperature in the room dropped again. Oh my God, said Paul. The others looked up to see blood trickling out of John's mouth. All 5 of the young men's faces filled with fear, transfixed on John's face. As they watched the blood run down his chin, they didn't even notice the glass in their hands. It was moving. Portal, 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 the glass was spelling. The demon was trying to enter their world. All 5 guys struggled to push the glass to goodbye. The demon resisted them, but eventually they managed it. When they let go of the glass, it fell to the floor. And the group recited Our Father and ended the prayer within Jesus' name, Amen. They all rushed to turn on the lights and blow out the candles. And after John cleaned his mouth, he bought everyone some beer and they tried to joke it off and relax afterwards. Still, no one felt they should leave John alone that night, so they decided to sleep over and eventually drank themselves to sleep. Liam had a terrible nightmare. He found himself in a large room, in the middle of a circle of light. He couldn't see where he was because the room was billowing with a dark, smoky mist, but he could hear high-pitched whispering in the shadows around him. Slowly, the whispers became louder and turned into voices. When they did this, Liam could finally make out what they were saying. We're going to get you. over and over again. Then the voices built into screams. We're going to get you. We're going to get you. Suddenly, hundreds of arms appeared through the mist. Liam was paralysed and unable to move. They were corpse-like, with talons on the ends of their fingers, and Liam couldn't see who the arms belonged to, but he knew the corpses were the embodiment of ill kill. The grey mist started to creep into Liam's circle of light, and with it came the dead arms. He had no way to escape this nightmare. He tried to scream, but no sound came out, and the arms grabbed him as he suddenly jolted awake. As he woke up, his friends were all sitting upright, terrified. When he explained what had happened, he was horrified to discover that all 5 of them had had the exact same dream. Thanks for listening. Which Ouija story did you find the scariest? Let me know in the comments below. You could also send me your scary stories to read out on the show to frombeyondsubmissions@gmail.com. And to listen to ad-free episodes and get a bonus episode every month exclusive to support us, head over to my Patreon, From Beyond Podcast. And I'll see you next time on From Beyond.